And after they had really ridiculed him and really tried to cut him down, Jackson stood up and he gave reasons why he did what he did and believed what he believed. And then he concluded the thing by saying, if you can show me through Scripture where I am wrong, I will change. And then somehow or another, we don't know exactly how, historians are divided on this, somehow or another, the statement got injected to that, here I stand, God help me, amen. Now, we don't know whether Luther really said that or not, but that has been injected into the little speech there that he gave. But the idea is that great men who stood for great causes, or causes that they were thoroughly convinced needed to be propagated or substantiated, they were people of determination. When we read the Bible, we find this everywhere we turn, that people who really wanted to change the world, people who really wanted to be devoted to God, they were people of great determination. If you're in school, you better have determination or you flunk. Maybe some of us understand that a little better than others. But all of it finally comes down to really how important is whatever I am supposed to be standing for. How important is it to me personally? And how important do I see this as something that I need to share with other people? My father-in-law was a very unusual man. I think he had a fourth grade education. He was raised on a Mississippi farm, and by the time he was 12 years old, he was making overnight trips here and there, for his father, taking care of some things that had to do with the farm. And he became a very responsible man. And as a young man, he met a young lady by the name of Gladys May. And they fell madly in love with each other and got married. They were over in Gulfport, Mississippi. And then they left Gulfport, Mississippi, and they went over to Tampa, Florida. And then ultimately they moved on up to, Jacksonville, Florida. They had no money. When they left Mississippi, they had $20. That's all, $20. He applied for a job. Of course, this was Depression days now, He applied for a job here, one there, and it was all no, we don't need anybody, we can't afford anybody. And so finally, there in Jacksonville, Florida, he went into an automobile parts store, and he applied for a job, and the parts man just said, I can't afford to hire you, I don't need you. My father-in-law said, I will work for you for a week and you don't have to pay me anything. But I want to show you that I can produce. I can do the things that you need done and you don't pay me a thing. If at the end of the week, if I'm worth it, go ahead and hire me. If I'm not, forget me. Well, they went ahead and hired him. He was an outstanding worker. A number of years after that, the owner of the automobile parts store said, we're going to open up a parts store down in Miami, Florida. And we want you to go down there and manage it. And by that time, he knew something about the parts business. And this was back in the 20s, you see. And he knew something about the parts business. And they moved down to Miami. And the parts, it just did real well. And he ended up buying the owner out. He bought the parts store. And then he started a parts business of his own. And he ended up with about 5 different businesses over the state of Florida. Why? Because he was determined. He was determined to be a success. Determination overcomes so many obstacles that stand in the way of people succeeding. You take families that are having trouble, You take husbands and wives who are at odds with each other. You take brothers and sisters the same way. Within the business community, you take this same idea. And if people are determined to be successful, the chances are very good that they'll be successful. But if they kind of just flow along with the tide and, well, no, I don't have a job today. Maybe something will come tomorrow. It didn't come tomorrow. Well, maybe another week, I'll find something. But there's no determination there. The chances are very good that they will not get something that's permanent. Why? Because the determination is not there. Story after story after story can be brought up in reference to this very thing. There are some great examples of determination in the Bible. One of the stories that I just love is the story of Joseph. Joseph had a tough time, even though he was the fair-haired boy, in their family. His brothers didn't like him. They ridiculed him. They ended up selling him as a slave. I mean, there's some things my brothers didn't like about me, but none of them ever wanted to sell me as a slave. But they sold him as a slave, but he was determined to be the kind of person he ought to be. And he was purchased by a man named Potiphar. And because he was such a good servant, Potiphar turned the whole works over to him, the whole household. And then Potiphar's wife made some passes at him, and Joseph ran away, and then she was humiliated. And you remember the story. She accused him of committing adultery with her. Well, let's stop for a moment. Joseph at this time was about 18, 19 years old, right in through there. And now this very substantial woman, so far as place in the community is concerned, she was the wife of Potiphar, who was a captain in the army and all. The opportunities that he had, he said, no. I will not do something that I know is wrong. And so he ran and left her holding his garment. He was determined that he would not do that thing. They put him in jail. You remember that? Put him in jail. He was determined to be a good prisoner. And so they turned the jail over to him. And then you remember when he was brought before King Pharaoh, and Pharaoh ended up making him putting him in charge of the whole thing of distributing this food and all, storing the food and then later distributing the food. Joseph was determined. He was determined to be a successful person. And so the story is just a wonderful story in the way it develops and in what we find out about this fella by the name of Joseph. More space is devoted in the book of Genesis to Joseph and Abraham and Jacob than any other person in the entire book of Genesis. Well, they were great men, each of them very much determined. Churches are like this. When churches are absolutely determined to grow, churches grow because they plan for it. They make sacrifices for it. There's all kinds of things that they do because that's their passion. That's their determination. This is something that churches everywhere need. You've heard of the 80-20 rule? You know what that is. 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. It's too bad that it's that way, but folks, that's just kind of the way things are. We as Christians need to remember that God can use our talents. He can use our abilities. I don't know what yours might be, but God can use that somehow or another. It may take some figuring. It may take some work. It may take some imagination and creativity, but you can find a way that God can use you. Determination is very important in this. I wrote down a few secular people here that I think all of us have admired, some of them anyway, at various times. Maybe we don't know a whole lot about a fellow named Demosthenes. He's famous for just one thing, but Demosthenes was born as a very weak baby. As he grew up, his lung capacity was very short. He had an impediment in his speech. He had a number of different problems like this. His lung capacity meant that he couldn't hold out for a very long time, and his impediment in his speech meant that he couldn't speak very clearly. And then, in addition to that, he was I guess we call him a mumbler. Well, what did he do? His vocal cords were very, very weak, so what did he do? He went out to the seashore, and where the waves were breaking and making such a big noise, he spoke to the waves over the noise that was being made, and that way he strengthened his vocal cords. And then in addition to that, he would climb mountains, and all the way up the mountain or the hill, he would be speaking loudly so that he could develop his lung capacity. And then I think the one that everybody knows is he put rocks in his mouth, and he spoke with rocks in his mouth so that he could develop a little better articulation. What happened? He turned out to be one of the great orators of ancient Greece. Determination. He had his mind made up. I'm not going to let this thing get the best of me. I am going to conquer this, whatever it might be. And he did. Well, there's another man who's a whole lot closer to us, still not in our generation. But you know the story of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born of poor parents in a little log cabin in Kentucky. He did not have a formal education, hardly any to speak of, but he determined to be an educated man. And what did he do? He literally walked miles to find books, and he would bring them home and he would read them by candlelight after he finished all of his work during the day. He would read the books by candlelight. And of course we know the story of Abraham, how he turned out to be one of the greatest statesmen in the history of our country. Actually one of the greatest statesmen I guess we could say in the history of the whole world. Why? Determination. He was determined that he would grow up as an educated man. Think of what the Civil War period would have been like without Abraham Lincoln. As a matter of fact, we really don't like to think about that, do we? We realize that here is a man who fit right into the time, and he was a man of wisdom, a man of determination. And so when he was so determined about the thing that he did, it developed something in him that made him also a compassionate man. And when it looked like the Civil War was going to be won by the North, by the Union, some of them in his cabinet were talking to him about, what are we going to do with these rebels? How are we going to punish these rebels? What are we going to do with them when this war is over? Abraham Lincoln said, we're going to treat them just as if they had never left. Or words to that effect. I've forgotten exactly what the words were. But the idea is that when we become so determined, and I'm not bullheaded, I'm not talking about being stubborn or bullheaded, I'm talking about being determined. When we come to be determined for good things, right things, it has a way of developing a sense of compassion so that we look at other people in ways that we might be able to help them become what they want to be and what they need to be. Well, when I first started preaching, I was still a student at David Lipscomb College, and I was preaching for a congregation there, the Lindley Avenue Church. And right down the street from us, about those 3 blocks, I guess, there was the Tennessee School for the Blind. And they took children who were blind, and literally it was a school for them, because the blind children could not take care of themselves otherwise. And this was, you see, this was back in the early 1950s, 1950, 51, right in through there. And so there were not as many organizations to help with this as there are now. One of the things I remember about the blind school was the determination of these children, 12, 13, 14 years old, on up to about 16 and 17, the determination of these children to live the very best life they could live. And one of our members there was one of the in the administration of the blind school. And I went over to the blind school, and saw the children that came to our congregation and all. And it's just interesting, because right away Brother Burch. They heard my voice. And you see, they found out that there were things that they could do, that they could recognize, that would help them overcome that deficiency of being able to see. And some of them could see a little bit, but most of them were totally blind. But it was a refreshing thing, and that's the best word for it, I think. It was a refreshing thing to go over there and see these kids who were really going to make a life for themselves. And of course, you remember Helen Keller. Well, she was not there, but that type of person certainly was there. And these people are great people because they were so determined that their lives would not be lost because they had something wrong with them. They were blind. We see some of our servicemen and women coming back from the wars, double amputees who have learned to walk again, learned to run again, people who have both arms amputated because of the war, who are learning to do things now. There was a little girl that I, for the life of me, I cannot understand this. She was born with no legs and no arms. And it showed a movie of how she got along. It was a horrible, horrible thing to think about. But she did not allow that just to destroy her. And so there are all kinds of wonderful stories like that we can look at and see how people who are in terrible circumstances, how it is that they have overcome some of those things. There's a good story. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is found in the book of Nehemiah. It's interesting the way this thing developed. Nehemiah was one of the captives over in Babylon, and so Nehemiah found out that the things were not going well back at Jerusalem, where they were trying to restore some things. The wall was broken up, and the gates of the city had been burned out, and all of this. And everybody just sitting around saying, "Oh me, oh me, oh me, we can't do anything." Nehemiah came over there, and one night he got on his horse and he rode around, all around, looked at the wall all over the place. And he came back and he said, "Yeah, we're really in a mess." I don't think he put it exactly that way, but that was the idea. We really are in a mess. Now, what are we going to do about it? And then he made a wonderful statement. He says, "Let us rise up and build." And because of the determination of Nehemiah to get the job done, the whole works fell in behind him. And they began building the wall. And it's so interesting. It's a great book. You ought to read it if you haven't read it lately. It's just a great book. And it tells about how this group of people built the wall from here to here. and how the wall was coming along the structure. And then another group of people and tells who was in charge and all. They built the wall from there to there and so forth. And it's just an exciting book to read, because you sit down and say to yourself, before Nehemiah came, they were sitting around looking at each other and saying, we're in a mess. And when Nehemiah came, because of his determination, it just, I can just see it just oozing out of him. The determination that he had became contagious. And let us rise up and build. Yes, that's what we've got to do. Why? Determination of this man. And then there's a great celebration when it's all over. You see, determination takes goals. It isn't just being determined that counts. It's, what is my goal? What am I trying to accomplish? This may be personal. It may be corporate. It may be church-wide. It may be business. It may be family. But there need to be goals. That's where we intend to be next year. I did a church growth workshop up at Chico, California, a number of years ago. And one of the things that they did, that they sat down and said, in the workshop, I don't tell anybody what they're supposed to do, but they determined that. But they were talking about their growth and how long would it take us to double the size of our congregation. And they sat down and just thought, well, if we can convert X number of people a year, 3 or 4, over in the next 8 years or 10 years or whatever it was, we will have doubled the size of the congregation. Hey, folks, put goals out there, and people will marry that's an expression that I've used with them. I've used it in so many things. They will marry the goal. And the goal is just as important to that person as that own person's body is to him. And he marries that goal. And that's the idea. What? Determination. They've got a goal. I am determined to make that goal. Well, I remember when my wife and I were dating, I thought, boy, she could have any guy in the state of Florida. And I'm determined, and I was determined, and I'll tell you, determination pays off. It really does. But the whole idea was that when something is near and dear to us, and there is a challenge before us, we respond with determination. If there's something that's pretty nice, wouldn't it be nice if we doubled the size of this congregation? Oh, just think of that. Wouldn't that be nice? Folks, it ain't going to fly. It's not going to fly. It's not until that becomes something that absorbs us. Not just in reference to a congregation, but in reference to all of the things in my life that are worthwhile, that I need to stand for, that I need to work toward. Let the goal be set out there and let me work toward it. And that's where determination really begins to take hold. Well, how do we develop this? How do we develop this whole idea of determination? One of the things that we really need is not only this goal, but the goal has to be realistic. It has to be challenging, but it has to be realistic. Let me give you an idea. We were talking, when I was preaching in Pasadena, we were talking about goals and attendance goals and things like this. And I said, well, what is the real goal of the congregation? And one of the elders there, he says, convert Pasadena. Well, that'd be a great thing, convert Pasadena. That's challenging, but it was not realistic. Instead of convert Pasadena, the idea had to come down to people, individuals, numbers of people, What are going to be our goals? And so one of the things that we have in getting determination in line here is to have goals that are realistic, goals that we can meet, but goals that are challenging. So, I might say, well, one of the goals of our congregation is to have one more person in attendance, average attendance, next year that we have this year. That's not a very challenging thing, is it? One more person. That's just not very challenging at all. But if we begin planning toward what we can do and make it challenging but realistic, determination begins to play an important role. This one's kind of hard. We have to be able to see eternity. Now, I just don't know how to express this, but we need to have eyes that focus on our ultimate goal of pleasing God in eternity. Paul said in the 2 Corinthians letter, he said, don't look at the things that are temporal. Look at the things that are eternal. And he says, the temporal things, they're going to pass away. The eternal things are going to stay. And so while we're possibly doing a lot of housekeeping chores and things like that, we may be very, very busy doing things like this, but our real goal has to be to bring people to the Lord, to bring people to Christ. And so we need to be thinking in terms of eternity rather than thinking in terms of just temporal things that go along. Paul had a great insight. I've never been in jail. Well, yes, I have too. I've been in jail a number of times. Every year, when I was in New Orleans, every year we went down to the jail, and we had a Christmas service for the inmates there in the jail. And I don't know how many years they'd been doing that, but we did that every year that I was there. And that's the only time I've been in jail. But it exposed me to the fact that, oh wow, this is not a very good life. Being in jail is not a very good life. A lot of resentment, especially if you're there on a false charge. Well, when Paul was in jail, he wrote the most optimistic letter in the entire New Testament, the book of Philippians. It's even called Paul's Epistle of Joy. He wrote it while he was in jail. And he was in jail on a false charge. You see, when the goal is there, the determination follows, and it changes one's whole life and one's whole attitude about things. And so he wrote to them, and he said, forget the things that are behind and look forward to the things that are before. Now, isn't that some statement for a man to say when he's in jail on a false charge? But it seems that he wasn't sentenced. He was just thrown in jail, and maybe he'll be there until the day he rots. Who knows? Well, there are all kinds of examples that the Bible gives us about people who are determined. The success of Christianity. Christianity came to you. It came to me because of the determination of some other people. Is there somebody who can say it was because of the determination of this person, that person, another person that I came to Christ? Can someone say that about you? Can someone say that about me? You see, determination plays a very, very important role in the practical, everyday things of the Lord's church. Now, if you're not a Christian tonight, this would be a wonderful time for you to become a Christian, to obey the gospel, to be baptized into Christ. And we're going to sing this invitation song that Joe has announced, and we invite you to respond. Shall we stand while we sing?